first verse. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took our pain and bore our suffering, yet we consider him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer, and though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thought a bit about is how these words, this letter, is written by Peter to a group of people to help them, if you like, stand tall and confident through all the challenges that life brings. It's a letter written designed to give people balance, to help them so that when life throws things at them or the ground shifts under their feet, they themselves aren't knocked over and end up sprawling on the floor, if you like, but they are standing confident. The thing is, that's just a word picture, isn't it? What does it actually mean in practice to have that stance through life? What's it going to mean tomorrow morning for us to walk out into the world and not be knocked off our feet? We don't know what will happen tomorrow morning. You might have hopefully some sense of what's in your diary, on your calendar, and as you think about those things, they might either fill you with confidence or with dread or nothingness, just sort of a grey day coming up. Peter really wants us to take what we're learning in church on a Sunday and to put it into practice, that our lives would be changed when we go out from here. But how? What does it look like to have this stance of confidence in the real world? I think that's what's going on. That's the sort of issue that Peter's addressing in chapters 2 and 3, the bit we read. And what it really means, I think, to have a confident stance in the world has all to do with living as free people. That's where Peter, if you like, begins his application of all that Jesus has done and the hope we have in him. He says it directly in verse 16, live as free people. The problem is, he then goes on to say, live as God's slaves, just at the end of that very same verse. And perhaps as you heard it, he might be saying live as free people, and then he spells out situations where people are very, very much unfree, at least in his day. I mean, we get it obviously in the slaves' message. he says, live as free people. He's concerned that they're free. And then he says to the slaves, submit to your masters, in about as unfree a situation as you could possibly imagine. And similarly with the word to the wives, which is very difficult to hear, isn't it? I wince every time I get to these sort of places in Scripture. In Peter's day, wives would basically have been the property of their husbands. And Peter doesn't say to them, get out of that situation. It's very difficult. So he says, live as free people. Then he says, you're God's slaves. And he seems to go deliberately for situations when in his own day, people would not have been free by our understanding. They would not have been able to exercise their sort of human rights in any meaningful sense. They were in situations of great constraint. And yet somehow, I think Peter thinks that they can still live as free people, these Christians he's writing to, even in those situations. And almost he's picked two of the hardest situations in which you could imagine living as a free person to demonstrate the difference that the Christian message makes in someone's life. That's what I think is going on with this idea of freedom in this letter. But to really understand it, we need to just think a little bit about what Peter really means when he says live as free people. You engage with ideas of freedom in the contemporary world. Basically today, we almost inherently, implicitly think of freedom as the removal of constraints. That's basically the definition of freedom that most people would just sort of, knee-jerk reaction assume to be what's going on. So we might talk about freedom of speech, no one constraining what you can say. A free press, no one passing laws that dictate who may or may not, what they may or may not print. Free movement, removing all barriers to migration. Freedom in sort of contemporary language means removal of constraints. I think it means something deeper and better and different from that for Peter. And the clue really is in that first verse of the reading, verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. The word sinful desires is an extraordinary word that Peter chooses there. The word is almost sinful over desires. The way that Peter, I think, is looking at the world is that in our lives, talking about our own sort of internal psyche, if you like, we have all kinds of desires for things, some of which are bad, but many of which are good. And the deep problem of the human condition is not only that we, if you like, feed our evil desires when they're there, but maybe even more dangerous, desires that are good become overinflated. They get bigger than they should. They take the place of other things. We get them sort of out of order. And the enormous challenge for human beings is to rightly order the things we love, the things we long for, the things we desire, so that we will be able to live healthy, balanced lives. And I think that gives us a bit of a clue to what freedom really means for Peter. It does mean removing some constraints, no doubt about that. Peter was a good Jewish man who remembered the Exodus, the way that God led his people out of slavery. He removed those chains of oppression. So freedom does involve removing some constraints. But at the same time, it also means for Peter, if you like, putting in place the right constraints, the good constraints that will enable us to flourish. A simple example. I might want to decide to be free from certain laws. But if I tried to be free from the law of gravity, my life would end pretty quickly. If I walked up to the top of the tower here and said, I'm going to be free from gravity, and walked off, obviously, I'd be shown up to be the fool that I would be. There are certain laws, if you like, which don't constrain us or don't sort of oppress us. They're there for our good. That's an example of what we might call a natural law that fits into that category. But here's another one. Marriage. I had the privilege over this past week of officiating at the wedding of Zena and Callum. Zena was a member of our church during lockdown and just afterwards. And it was an absolute privilege and delight to officiate at her wedding to Callum. And one of the most striking things was that many of the guests hadn't really, I don't think, heard the Church of England marriage service. The wedding happened in Scotland, and in Scotland you can basically write your own vows. So people would have been to lots of weddings and not heard what the Church of England liturgy is, but as an Anglican minister, I'm bound to use that liturgy, so that's the wedding service we followed. And I think that the most striking thing to people, and it sort of catches me every time I do a wedding, is that in a wedding, you make the most enormous promises, binding yourself to one person for the rest of your lives. Now, in a broken, fallen world, obviously, sometimes that doesn't work out. But the idea, the genius, but also the challenge of the marriage service and of being married is you say, I will constrain myself to belong to one person for the rest of our lives together, till death us do part. And in one sense, you might say, I have lost all my freedom to pursue romantic relationships anywhere else. And at the same time, that is for my very best, because that creates a field in which roses can grow. Love, true love, can deepen and flourish. We learn to give ourselves to someone else. We learn the hard road of commitment and care and affirmation and protection. Françoise Sagan was a French sort of atheistic philosopher, and she said at one point in her life, I was obviously less free when I was in love with someone, but one's not in love all the time. Apart from that, I've been free. There are certain things which constrain us in our lives, and in one sense make us less free, if you just think freedom is removing all your constraints, and yet therefore are good. And I think Peter is saying here that when we come back to God through Jesus Christ, not only are we freed from constraints that are harmful for us, but we come back and find that under God, living as God's slaves, we are constrained in ways that do us enormous good. In the midst of a broken world, we can be, if you like, transformed by God, put back to where we should be, where we then can, go out into the world and be agents for good, for peace, for kindness, for love, as we live as these free people, slaves of God. And that's where I think Peter's case studies come in. Because, we mentioned already the slaves and the wives. But the first case study he gives is, in its own way, I think, as shocking, or it would have been, to Peter's hearers. Because the first case study is government. Peter says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. Now, it's right to sort of apply that in our own lives as we think about what this means in terms of paying our taxes and obeying red lights and stopping when a police car pulls us over. Those are all in this category of submitting to authorities. But in Peter's day, the authorities were just quite frankly brutal. We have the benefit of living in a society where for many years at least, we've been able to trust, everyone will be able to trust our government to be in the best interests of all of us. They're our servants. In Peter's day, it simply was not like that. And so as much as the shock of hearing what he says to slaves and to these wives, Peter's hearers would have been shocked, I think, to hear him say, submit yourselves to every human authority, and even more, honor the emperor. The government of Rome, the Roman Empire in its structures, I think, in many, many ways was bad, was laced with evil and selfishness. Peter doesn't immediately say, overturn it. Similarly with slavery, Slavery in Peter's day, although it was a bit different from the sort of chattel slavery of the 18th and 19th centuries, the transatlantic slave trade, it was a wicked institution. And Peter doesn't straight away say to the slaves, overturn it. The sort of patriarchy where wives are the property of their husbands was a wicked institution. And yet Peter doesn't straight away say, overturn it. What he says instead is that if you are a Christian believer, you can live within those structures and be an agent for good and for change in the midst of them. And over time, I think, trust that God will bring justice and those structures will be challenged and overcome, but not straight away. And here's how it works. In each of those structures in society, Peter says if you're a Christian, you are no longer under your slave master. You're under God. You are no longer under the emperor. You're under God. God is your master. If you're a wife, you're no longer the property of your husband. You belong to God. And yet, precisely because you belong to God, you can patiently, lovingly, kindly submit even in those contexts where the structures are bad. You can lovingly and patiently endure what those who are over you, what they do to you. And there'll be all kinds of challenges in that, and you'll want to fight back when they mistreat you. You'll want to kick out at them. You'll want to overturn the whole thing. And I know this is a very difficult word for us to hear today. And it's equally important to say that in all of these structures, these relationships, Peter is absolutely not opposed to justice. And in fact, it was the very, if you like, the seeds of what Peter's talking about here eventually led to the overturning of the sort of vision of empire that the Romans instigated, the overturning of slavery, the restoration of marriage out of this warping where men had power, absolute power control, and women were just property. But the point is, in Peter's own day, he is saying that the difference that Jesus Christ makes is that you can endure now even the bad constraints of a society that is turned away from God. And even in those hardest of relationships and hardest of contexts, you can do enormous good, be a blessing, be a sort of beacon of light and hope. I want to suggest just 3 things this might mean for us as we sort of try and put it into practice in our own lives. The first is a sort of general thing, which is that if we sort of take the big lessons from these chapters, I think we have to say something like this, that the God that we worship isn't, if you like, our service provider. He's not someone that we come to and cut a deal with and say, well, here's what I want from you, God. Can you give that to me? It's tempting over and over again in our lives just to treat even church services and our own relationship with God as if we play our part, we'll get from God the sort of stuff we need, whether it's inner peace or a sense of purpose and belonging. When we come to passages which I really do acknowledge are difficult words to hear, if you like, our first stop along the way is to say, well, God is not at sort of my beck and call. God might have a vision for my life, which when I first hear it, I struggle with. But if he is God, if he is the creator, the uncreated creator of all that we see and all that we can't, then it is just possible. We have to be open, I suppose, to the possibility that though these things are hard to hear, they are the sort of, if you like, good restraints that he puts on us. Not belong to these structures, these turned away from God structures of slavery, of empire, of patriarchy, But the good restraint of saying, God, I am your slave now, and you don't tell me to just kick off these structures, but you tell me to, in the midst of them, be an agent for good. Though that is hard to hear, it is maybe the sort of thing we might expect the uncreated creator who knows and sees and cares and understands far, far better than we do, to every now and then say things that we find very difficult. Second sort of way to apply this, though, is to notice how Jesus is our model throughout. You know, right at the heart of the passage is that passage from Isaiah 53. And we hear it quoted over and over again by Peter. And the point I think he's making is this. Yes, in these different contexts where things are unjust and unfair and unkind and you feel weak and powerless, it feels really hard to go the way of submitting to God and being a blessing. But that is exactly what Jesus himself did. It would have been so easy and right and good and appropriate for Jesus to call to judgment every single one of those people who persecuted him to death. He was illegitimately treated, unjustly sentenced, put to death, the most scandalous act in history. The Creator stepping in and being kicked into the garbage. And yet Peter says, Jesus, though he could have overturned the whole system, out of love for God, submitted to that. And by doing so, brought enormous blessing in our lives. And Jesus' death here, Peter sees as an example for us, a way that we can, if you like, follow in the footsteps of our Saviour. By all the ways in our own lives, we are, if you like, treated unjustly, and we want to fight back. Though there is a time for that, there is also a time for submitting and being reviled, having spoken ill against, not getting what you want. And yet through that to bring blessing just as Jesus did. And the third thing to notice, I think, is this, that this kind of way of using your freedom as a Christian, putting yourself under God as his slave and listening and following his path that he calls you to walk, has enormous power to change the world. I mean, from these kind of beginnings in 1 Peter chapter 2 and 3, these sorts of words, the example of Jesus himself, made the early church into a power like no one had ever seen before. But it was a power operating through love and service and goodness and kindness and laying down rights and giving up power. One ancient writer put it like this, and we'll finish with these words. This is from a letter called the Epistle to Diognetus. And it talks about the difference the different way that Christians live their lives compared to their surrounding culture. Let me read this to you. For the Christians are distinguished from other men, neither by country, nor language, nor the customs which they observe. For they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a peculiar form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity, but inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them has determined, and following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry as do all others. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. In our own lives, there'll be all kinds of ways in which we too can be slaves of God and live and serve as patient, kind citizens in contexts and cultures which we will find difficult and would much rather just kick back and do our own thing. But the example of Jesus and the example of the early church is if we follow that way of humble service, we can both be blessed and be an enormous blessing. Let's take a moment in silent prayer as we respond to this, and then Anne Horder's going to come up and lead us in some prayers of intercession.